great panelists here with us this evening. We're going to start with James, as you see on this screen, and then give Len an opportunity to present on the behalf of One Shoreline, and then go to Dana Breckwald from there. So James, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you to get us started.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. And Troy. The topics I'm going to discuss this evening are primarily sea level rise and the vulnerability assessment that we did, and the Redwood Shores levees. I'm James O'Connell. I'm the Assistant Director of Engineering and Transportation for the city. Happy to engage with anybody and answer any questions you may have proceeding. Next slide. So this evening, I'm going to primarily talk about the sea level rise vulnerability study that the city has been doing. The main takeaway that you should have this evening is that I am just giving very broad oversight of what that study is. There is a city council discussion that we will be having on the 4th of November, this coming Monday. Anybody who is interested in this topic should definitely come to that city council meeting. That will be where we have the primary focus with our city council members to discuss this topic. So definitely encourage everybody to come to that if they're interested. Just going to talk very briefly about the adaptation planning approaches, and then a little bit about what we are looking at with the Redwood Shores levees. Next slide. So with the sea level rise vulnerability study, basically in the very basics of it, we looked at how sea level rise is going to affect our coastal parts of our city. It was broken down into different reaches. You can see that reach 1 is Redwood Shores. That is the primary area that is being considered as part of this project. There's other reaches that affect the city, and parts of San Carlos. I'll get into how we're looking at that as well. But that's more or less how it is broken down. Next slide. And more or less, what it's looking at is different hazards that may affect the different parts of the city. I think Troy did a pretty good job of explaining, what the potential is for different scenarios. That's more or less what's identified on the map. You have the different colors to identify how there's different potentials for sea level rise. Primarily, Redwood Shores, because it's protected by levees, the idea should largely be that, the levees are raised and it's not going to be affected by those different scenarios. But you can see other parts of the city affected in this map. Next slide. So with reach 1 in the sea level rise vulnerability study, what it did was it looked at the different elevations that are affected as part of the different, primarily the levees. And so coastal flooding, as you can see on the map, is a huge potential impact. Again, as Troy mentioned, sea level or the groundwater inundation is likely another significant impact. And so for anybody who doesn't know, the stormwater primarily goes from different communities in Redwood Shores, and it goes to the lagoon. The lagoon is controlled by the city. We pump out a certain amount of stormwater during different times of the year. We pump out extra during the rainy season in order to allow for additional elevation, so that the stormwater can come into the lagoon, and then we can basically control, how that stormwater is pumped out into the bay. With groundwater inundation, that will be more of a challenge. We are looking into that. That is, a thing we're figuring out. But generally, that's what the effects of sea level rise are going to be. We need to build up the levees, and at the same time, we need to, figure out how to control the lagoon to ensure that the stormwater controls are in place. Next slide. Thank you. So quickly, and adaptation planning approaches. You can see basically there are 4 types of approaches: protect, accommodate, retreat, and hybrid. It's very simplistic for this area in particular. It is basically a built-up levee. The idea is to build it up more. I don't think the idea will be to include any sort of flood wall, but generally build up the levees and ensure that it's protected. Next slide. So getting onto the Redwood Shores levees, this is a thing that we've been working on for a long time. So back, just to give you some history, going back to April 2020, the FEMA identified that the levees no longer met accreditation requirements. So this is identified as a seclusion area. It more or less means that the FEMA said that we need to do more to build up the levees. We worked very closely with SHORELINE, and we basically submitted an application for the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The idea is that, obviously we need to build up the levees. FEMA identified that, and so we are working towards that end. All of that is kind of a work in progress. For FEMA, there's really they identified basically all over the Bay Area that there were run-up actions that meant that all of the levees or all of the coastal areas needed to be raised up. And so, we're all just kind of dealing with that. Next slide. So here you can see the Redwood Shores levee area. This is what was submitted as part of the FEMA Hazard Grant Mitigation. And basically, the city has about $2.7 million as part of that grant. The different agencies that are included in that have to be responsible for about 0.7 million of that. And what it is meant to cover is essentially the design and investigations and environmental documentation of building up the levees. So you can see in the map, there is the red, which is the current levee area. And then there are some alternatives for different alignments of how to fix the levee. The dash, or the dash is the different alignments. It is most expected that we will work with Belmont to extend the green part. You can see on the upper part of the screen to include the levees and basically connect to the great work that Foster City has been doing nearby. But basically, the idea is to build up all of the existing levee and or extend it as much as we can. And as I mentioned before, that includes the San Carlos airport area. Next slide. So the next steps, essentially, with the different agencies, you can see them on the screen. We've been engaging with all of these agencies, and what we're doing is we're working to develop an RFP to our request for proposals, where we basically get consultant help to develop these designs and environmental documentation. We have met with all of these agencies. We should have an RFP soon, and we very much expect to get the different agencies on board to to work towards building up these levees. There are some challenges. The different cities, like Belmont, we're basically extending into part of the city where levees aren't quite built up the same way as in Redwood Shores. There is the airport, where there's the potential to have to extend into the slough to ensure their level of service is maintained. We're kind of working through all of those things, but basically we will come up with a memorandum of understanding. We will be working with all these agencies, and we will be moving towards getting that all built up. So more or less concludes my slides, and thank you.
Great, thanks so much, James. Appreciate that. And thank you all for keeping the questions coming. We're trying to answer those that we can in real time. And again, we'll hope to come back and circle back during the discussion to answer any other. So next, we're going to hand it over to Len from One Shoreline. Len, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dave. Appreciate that. And thanks for the folks attending. Looking forward to your questions. Yeah, so One Shoreline is the short version of our name, which is the San Mateo County Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. We were created by state law 5 years ago. And I'll give a brief overview of One Shoreline, what we're up to, and dive into a little bit about our work on land use planning and a little bit more detail in the rest of it. You can advance the slide, please. Yeah. So, bit of background. 65 years ago, flood control district was established by the state, and it raised property taxes and did work in areas of the county that were prone to flooding, but it only covered about 10% of San Mateo County, and none of the city of Redwood City was included in that. Meanwhile, in the last 10 years or so, there have been studies by various entities. The ones shown here are related to a grand jury report that looked at sea level rise vulnerability in our county, and other studies that looked at our vulnerability relative to other counties, both around the Bay and around the state. And here's a study by MTC or ABAG and BCDC regional agencies looked at the resilience costs, and San Mateo is the highest. The Stanford study looked at a number of housing units that were subject to sea level rise vulnerability. And the image at the right of that is a Scripps Institute study looking at coastal erosion for cities and county areas on the Pacific side. So they all pointed to, we have a common vulnerability to many of the threats of climate change, common among other counties in the state, but a unique vulnerability to sea level rise, partly because we have both a bayside and coastside. Bayside super low lying, like the area of Redwood Shores, and all of our 53 miles of the county, and lots of erosion concerns on the Pacific side. So this transformative, you're going a little quick, Dave. This transformative challenge, the cities got together with the county and realized that they were not well positioned to address it individually. And Dave, go ahead. And so in 2019, there was legislation to create One Shoreline as the first government agency in California to plan and build resilience to the water-related impacts of climate change. We don't deal with wildfire, but we deal with most of the other issues that climate brings, including those listed here. You can advance the slide. So our priorities for this year, I'm going to talk about 4 of them, 3 of them briefly, and dive into one of them a bit more. In terms of projects, we are involved with several projects on the Bayside and on the Pacific side. Here's a snapshot of the Bayside projects. Not all of them are One Shoreline at all, but it just gives you a sense that there's 53 miles, as I said, of our county shoreline from East Palo Alto to Brisbane. And there are really 10 different efforts in those 53 miles. And they relate to the 11 cities that touch the Bay in our county. And if you include all the cities that are influenced by high tides in the Bay, that would add a 12th city of San Bruno. But there are 11 cities that touch the Bay, and here are some of the projects that are involved with those cities. Go ahead and advance it. So we were established as a long-term resiliency agency, but the atmospheric rivers that we saw in 2021, we opened our doors January 2020, but the big storms that we saw in 2021, 2022, and 2023 had us add and focus to those climate change issues associated with these big storms and reducing the impacts of and giving people early warning to the storm-induced flooding. The red stars indicate all the areas of the county we're working either in early warning or removing debris from creeks that are prone to flooding, including 2 creeks that influence Redwood City. Next, yeah. And so the final priority before I get to the fourth is related to our long-term funding. We receive funding from all the cities in the county and the county itself. We've been able to extend that funding quite a bit, and we're working to extend it further now. But we also need a long-term funding stream to deal with this long-term challenge. And then finally, our priority related to land use, private development, public infrastructure, so that future climate-driven conditions are imparted on both our public infrastructure and private development, and that's done in coordination with regional projects. So I'll spend a few minutes on that. I won't really dive into our project work unless there are questions. I think that James did a good job covering the project in Redwood Shores, and we look forward to being a partner with the cities on that. But I won't really talk more about the specific project work unless there are questions. So Redwood City has the longest shoreline of any of the 11 cities in San Mateo County. It's actually about a quarter of our county shoreline is in Redwood City. So it really has the most to gain and potentially to lose about this whole issue of sea level rise, groundwater rise. You can advance the slide. Here's a photo taken from the Redwood Life area, actually the path just next to Bridge Parkway. And in case you're wondering if this is a kind of a long-term future issue, this is during a very high tide, but you can see the water level is quite close to the top of the path. And so this is something that has some level of urgency for us here at One Shoreline. Okay, and so getting to the target of this effort regarding land use is development up to the water's edge or below ground where there's known shallow groundwater issues, or public infrastructure that doesn't accommodate today's storms, higher tides or rising groundwater. These pictures are from different cities on the peninsula, Redwood City and San Carlos and Burlingame, and there are different examples of public infrastructure and private development that's just too close to the water's edge. The picture, the third from the left or second from the right, is a Sunny Day, and this is a pump station that's directly opposite a new development that actually was just completed this year. And so these are the kinds of things that we want to be thinking about as we go forward with approving developments. Continue on the slides. So in 2023, after working on what we call planning policy guidance, we worked on it for about 9 months. We had reviews by the cities and the public. We received over 500 comments on the document. Our board adopted planning policy guidance that incorporated ideas regarding sea level rise, extreme storms, and groundwater rise, recommendations for cities to incorporate these things into their general plans, specific plans, and zoning ordinances. And now we're working with a collaborative of the county and 7 jurisdictions, I believe, to incorporate these issues into those additional 7 jurisdictions in 2025. You can advance the slide. So this year, we're now focused on public infrastructure, and we're starting that. And the goal of that is also to integrate climate risk into, in this case, the processes and city documents, county documents used to plan and design the backbone of our communities. And we're starting this process with stormwater systems, which are now generally designed to historic 10-year events rather than future larger events that we've seen. And also, in addition to stormwater systems, roadways and wastewater and water recycling systems. After these three topics are covered, we'll turn our attention to parks and utilities, other important aspects of our communities. Yeah, thank you. So what this looks like in terms of how development agreements are done and how private developments kind of play out. This is from the city of Burlingame. So we started our work on this topic with the city of Burlingame, and Burlingame developed a new zoning ordinance in late 2020. It was approved by city council, 2021, sorry. It was approved by city council, and it's led to development agreements like this one that talk about applicant building shoreline infrastructure to elevation that's specified in what's called a map of future conditions, which looks at sea level rise scenarios long term. And it also gives the opportunity for development to build to a lower elevation that's also FEMA certifiable, but providing a land easement to the city, or in this case in Burlingame, one shoreline, to come in later and build up that infrastructure. So it really, as part of the development process, talks about from the get-go, it talks about the need for shoreline infrastructure, and it doesn't assume that that's coming in years after or the development is completed, but it tries to bake it in from the beginning. And we would really encourage that this occur also in all developments along the Bay shoreline that are coming along. You can advance the slide, Dave. So it's important. This is just an image from one of the private developments that has such a development agreement, where they build resilience into their project that then becomes city approved. As I said, or provides land rights for that project. It's important that this is also done in coordination with a regional project. And it's great that there's both Redwood Life moving forward at the same time as a regional project around Redwood Shores. They should be working closely together, and I'm confident they will be in this case. In Burlingame, we're looked at the zoning ordinance, and many developments in Burlingame that are very large. We also have a regional project, and so we're working with the developers and with the city to ensure that the developments that abide by the zoning ordinance do so in a way that's copacetic to the project, the regional project, and the regional project can essentially fill in the gaps between the developments. And that's complicated, of course. This is all complicated and challenging, but that's kind of one of our main strategies. Just to say, there's also zoning ordinances in other cities that are similar. This is one from South San Francisco that also has a lot of development underway right now and in the planning pipeline. This is their most recent update to their zoning ordinance. So with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions, and turn it back to Dave.
Thank you so much, Len, and I apologize for moving a little too quickly.
It's okay. Yeah.
I definitely did not want to hurry that great presentation, so thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
Excellent. And I do see some more questions coming in, and the team is doing the best we can to answer those in the Q&A. But again, we'll highlight those that we can bring back as part of the discussion. So with that, we're going to come to our final speaker, Dana Breckwald with BCDC. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Dana. Getting tongue-tied. Over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks everyone for having me. I'm Dana Breckwald. I work on all things sea level rise adaptation at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. So if you want to go you can go one more slide forward. Double cover slides there. So if you are not familiar with BCDC, and few people are, we are actually a state agency that works to protect and enhance the San Francisco Bay and the Bay shoreline. And we have a large commission that guides the work that we do. We're at about 60 staff right now, and a number of advisory boards. We have an EJ advisors board. We have a local electeds task force. So we do quite a bit of engagement throughout the region for the work we do. We have two divisions at BCDC. One that most people are familiar with is the division that issues permits for any development that occurs either in the Bay or along a 100-foot band of the Bay shoreline. And then our planning division has been doing a lot of work in the past decade plus on working with cities and counties on how to adapt to sea level rise. So next slide, please. We are legislatively mandated to do this. There are a couple of bills that have passed in the past 20 years or so that name BCDC as one of the major agencies in the region that works on sea level rise adaptation. And most recently, and what I'm going to talk about most today, is a bill called SB 272 that passed last year that names BCDC as the agency that should coordinate mandatory sea level rise adaptation planning around the Bay. So I just want to show these little maps here on the right. BCDC's was originally created in 1965 primarily to stop bay fill. So I love these maps because the one in the middle there shows what the bay looked like in 1849 before it began to be filled by primarily the gold rush, and then later people were filling it intentionally to create more land for development. And BCDC sort of froze that shoreline in place in 1965 and prevented that from getting any worse. But sea level rise is actually taking us back to it wants to take us back to the shoreline that was more original to the bay. So if you look at the 1849 map and then the 6 foot of sea level rise map, they are quite similar. So BCDC's mandate has really gone from a shrinking bay to one that is now wanting to grow again. The problem is we've now developed along that 1965 shoreline, so we need to figure out how to manage that. Sorry, go ahead on to the next slide. So one of our major projects right now is called the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or the RSAP. And this is a region-wide plan for the Bay shoreline that helps to guide the creation of coordinated, locally planned sea level rise adaptation actions that can work together to meet regional goals, to make sure that we're all kind of going towards the same outcome, and that adaptation that happens in one part of the bay doesn't negatively impact people on other parts of the shoreline. This document, which is we're preparing to adopt it in December, contains a one bay vision, which I'll talk about, but that really sets out what the region wants the shoreline to look like if we're successful with adaptation. We've identified a number of regional priorities that we all need to work together to achieve in light of adaptation, and then guidelines for how cities and counties can do sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans, which are now required by law. And that's the next slide that I have there. So diving in a little bit deeper to SB 272, the bill actually mandates that local governments within BCDC's jurisdiction must complete a sub-regional shoreline adaptation plan by January 2034. It also names cities on the outer coast have the same responsibility, but a different agency that's administering that. It also names BCDC as the agency that's in charge of developing the guidelines to ensure consistency along those sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans by December 2024, which is right around the corner. And so that's what we've contained in this regional shoreline adaptation plan. And then BCDC uses those guidelines to review completed plans and approve them. There's also a carrot associated with this bill. If cities and counties complete these plans and BCDC adopts them in the timeline outlined in the bill, they become eligible for more funding to actually implement the plans. So next slide. So we have been really busy to make sure that the regional shoreline adaptation plan, the one bay vision, these regional priorities, as well as the guidelines that cities and counties are going to be using to develop their local plans. We've been talking to lots of people over the past year and a half to make sure that this is actually reflective of what the region wants. So we've had an advisory group, we have subcommittees, we have local elected officials that we're working with. We have gone out to many community meetings. These are pictures from some of the pop-up events we did. For example, we asked people, what do you care about in the future along your shoreline? What do you want the future to look like for your children? And that helped to drive our one bay vision. We've had the online surveys, public workshops, focus groups, all sorts of engagement. And overall, we've engaged hundreds of people throughout the development of the regional shoreline adaptation plan. Next slide. So one thing I want to mention here is that, this may seem kind of like a top-down mandate that people have to do, and we're telling you how to do this adaptation planning. But despite the fact that there is a fairly cohesive and extensive process that we're laying out to do these plans, we know that a lot of cities and counties, like Redwood City, have done a lot of planning for sea level rise already, have vulnerability assessments already in place, have started to develop adaptation strategies. So the goal of these guidelines is to lay out some standards, but at the same time, we wanted to ensure that there was some flexibility built in for work that has already been done. We wanted to make sure that this is aligned with what people were already doing. So we did look at quite a few adaptation plans that had already been developed in the region, said, what are they doing that's actually working? We're trying to, make it right-sized, which means it's a extensive plan, but that's really what's going to be necessary to ensure that we protect our entire shoreline. So trying to find the right balance of things that will actually be effective, but won't place undue burden on cities and counties. Building on existing efforts, that's really just how do we incorporate work that's already been done. And we want this to be effective. We want this to be a plan that lays out projects that are actually going to get built along the shoreline. The next slide. So I'll touch really briefly on the One Bay vision. We have a large vision statement for the whole region, and you can read along the left. I won't read it out loud. And then we have a specific vision for each of these 8 topic areas right here, talking about healthy communities, healthy baylands, development and land use, critical services, recreation along the shoreline, transportation, contamination, and then lastly, regional collaboration or coordinating with your neighbors. Next slide. Each of those 8 topic areas also has what we call a strategic regional priority. These are critical issues that affect the well-being of the entire region, but the issues must be addressed locally, and they cross jurisdictional boundaries. So you're really reliant on your neighbor to do the same thing that you're doing in your community for the success of the overall strategy. So these are things like looking at how sea level rise might cause displacement in your community and how you can use policy to avoid that, ensuring that our ecosystems are connected across jurisdictional boundaries, accommodating the fact that housing growth, accommodating new housing, particularly near transit, may have to occur along the shoreline, and balancing the trade-offs between the risks and the need for new housing, maintaining emergency services, connecting our shoreline parks and trails, ensuring we can still move people and goods around the region, prioritizing contamination, remediation of contamination in EJ communities, and understanding what the cross-jurisdictional impacts of flood risk reduction are. Several of these are relevant in this particular location. I think in particular, there is some critical services. There's an MTC growth geography in that location. So a couple of these would be applicable in this case. Next slide. And this has an animation, so you can just go all the way down until, there we go, keep going. So this just outlines what is going to be required in these sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans. A lot of this should look familiar. These are pretty common components of many different planning documents. As I said, many of these already are probably in place in Redwood City, such as the vulnerability assessment. But in general, what we're asking people to do is to assess what's there, assess what's vulnerable, identify concepts for how to approach adaptation over different time horizons, detail how land use and policy might need to change in the city to make those adaptation strategies happen, come up with a high-level plan for how those strategies will be implemented and funded. And then this last element, a priority project list, BCDC keeps a large database in the region of all adaptation projects that we're aware of. And this allows people to submit their projects into that database so that we can then use that list to, for example, advocate for funding and put together large regional grant packages and things like that. Next slide. This also has animations. You can click through that. Sorry, I forgot to take care of those. So there are also 4 minimum standards. These are things that everyone has to follow no matter what. These are standard sea level rise and flood hazard scenarios. So ensuring that everybody's evaluating the same hazards in their plans. Minimum categories and assets. So these are things like everyone should be looking at contamination, or everyone should be looking at certain categories of critical assets or Balin's habitats or things like that. There's an equity checklist for each of the plan elements that you saw on the previous slide to make sure that the process and the outcomes include equity. And then there are adaptation strategy standards, which are considerations that everyone should think through as they're identifying what strategies are most appropriate along the shoreline. Next slide. The document is going to be adopted by the end of this year, but we have many other resources that are in the pipeline that will help people apply the guidelines and do these sub-regional adaptation plans. One of which is our online mapping platform, and this is a online map that provides many of the data layers that we're requiring to do these adaptation plans. And it has a lot of functionalities, like you can click on a jurisdictional boundary and export an exposure analysis of that location based on the data that we have on the online mapping platform. So this should really reduce the burden of making lots of maps and trying to track down consistent data. We're also launching a local technical assistance program where we'll be working with cities and counties as they do these plans with things like templates for plan submittals, helping them build capacity locally for community members to be more engaged in adaptation planning, and all sorts of other resources that will help apply these guidelines and actually create these plans. I just have a couple more slides here. Just want to give a shout out for the grant program that we have been partnering with. It's open right now, and it has money available to complete these plans. It's the SB1 grant program. You can apply on a quarterly rolling basis. It's non-competitive, maximum $1.5 million. And we have about 6 or 8 communities around the Bay Area that have already successfully applied to this program and gotten funding to do these plans. And then my last slide really is just a timeline to show you of kind of where we've been and where we're going. We've really been developing the draft of this plan through kind of August, September of this year. We just wrapped up our public comment period mid-October. We beat you, Lynn. We got 618 public comments to your 500. So right now we're in the middle of developing our final draft, responding to all those public comments, and then our commission will vote to adopt the plan December 5th, 2024. And that is a public meeting. Anyone can come, provide public comment. And I just have one more slide that has my contact information on it in case you want to go to our website to learn more about this initiative, or sign up for our mailing list, or contact me directly. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dana, and thank you so much to our 3 presenters, James, Len, and Dana, for a great presentation. Just to, again, kind of give us, starting locally with what's happening in and around Redwood City, and then zooming out regionally, and even kind of around the state. I think it's really helpful for us to kind of gain that perspective as we talk about the Redwood Life project, but just dealing with these concerns of sea level rise generally. So we do have a lot of questions that have come in before we launch into them. We, again, just wanted to kind of gauge from you all what is kind of most important to you, kind of what's bubbling up and for you around these topics. So we came up with just 4 really quick questions. We have others as well that we could ask, but just kind of trying to gain your level of concern around sea level rise and flooding, around groundwater rise, and then understanding of the benefits, obviously, of dealing with some of these natural hazards, but then also kind of understanding maybe your concerns around things like evacuation plans. So as we get into this next phase of going through some of the questions that you had, we thought it might be nice to kind of turn it back over to you all, just to quickly gauge the pulse in the room. And fantastically, it looks like we have about 43 participants that have joined us. So clearly this is an important topic for you all, and we're really glad that you're taking advantage of these info sessions. And as a reminder, these are just as they're named, info sessions, informational sessions to provide a larger perspective. We don't anticipate talking specifically about the proposal about Redwood Life here tonight, but we really wanted to, again, kind of gain a larger perspective around these specific topics. And it's great to see some of the questions that are coming in. I'm going to pause here maybe just for 30 more seconds to see if we can get a few more respondents, and then share this poll back out to you all. And I'm sure you all are following along in the Q&A. As questions are being answered, you should all be able to see answers to those questions. And then I'm going to go ahead and verbalize a couple or a few here to our panel as well to get their thoughts on some of the questions that we could answer. And again, just as a quick reminder, we're not going to necessarily get to every single question here this evening. Those that we can't answer, we will. Those that we can't answer quite here tonight, we'll go ahead and take in and respond back hopefully through a Q&A. So I'm sorry, through an FAQ as part of the summary. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now just to share that back out with you all. And clearly, sea level rise and flooding in Redwood City is a large concern, as well as groundwater rise. As we anticipated, preparing for natural hazards can have benefits, and we were wondering which might be most important to you. That's around air and water quality, reducing wastes, increasing the ability to respond to climate-related hazards. And then there sounds like about half of you did show some concern, or those that did answer, around the adequacy of evacuation plans. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now, and I'm going to ask all the panelists if you can come back on video. And I'm going to pose a couple questions here that I was hoping we can get some verbal responses to. And James, I'm going to start with you. This is quite a long question, so bear with me. But it's stormwater drains from San Carlos to Belmont Hills in Belmont and Pulgas Creeks. They overflow their banks and periodically flood to adjacent streets. This water flows directly into the bay on both sides of Redwood Shores. Debbie was wondering if you could please describe the impacts of the stormwater flooding from these major creeks into the sloughs, and will this excess stormwater wind up trapping behind the levees and increase the risk of flooding in the Redwood Shores area, as was evident in December of 2022? So James, I'll turn it over to you to share your thoughts on that.
That's a very complex question, but for the most part, no. I mean, the sloughs are really designed, are meant to accommodate a lot of that stormwater runoff. At a certain point, once sea level rise occurs, that will be more challenging for it to happen. Once the sea level rises are higher, it won't be able to accommodate a lot of those storm events. But the inundation that occurs is always upstream, and so if it is coming from Belmont or San Carlos or wherever, it will basically be occurring upstream of that, and they will experience more flooding events, just like we all potentially will be. Depending on how we deal with it.
Thank you, James.
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I know it's a trick one, and I should have prefaced that by saying I know that there's a vulnerability assessment also coming up.
Well, and the vulnerability assessment, I should stress, is just the beginning point of it. It is us just looking at how we will be inundated with the stormwater, or the sea level rise and the effects of that, and potential stormwater control issues that come out of that. We do need to study this very strongly, and we are working towards that. And so that is the next steps. We are working towards that, but yeah, this is just the beginning points of we acknowledge that the sea level is rising and we need to figure out how to deal with it.
Great, great. Thank you, James. I'm going to pose a next question to Len, and that's what is One Shoreline's stance on underground parking and below grade building? Shouldn't these be prohibited due to groundwater displacement and sea level rise? I'm just going to get to what would this type of subsurface development increase risk of flooding potentially in and around the Redwood Shores area?
Yeah, I mean, I not to speak directly to Redwood Shores, but we've seen underground parking and underground mechanical equipment get flooded during the big storms, especially if they're adjacent to waterways, whether that's a shoreline or a creek, more often a creek in our area so far. So we would highly discourage underground parking and especially underground mechanical equipment in areas adjacent to water. The issue of groundwater rise, long-term issue. I think a lot of the infrastructure we're putting in now, we're assuming it's going to be around for a few decades. I would hope so. And there's still a lot of unknowns around groundwater rise, such that I think caution is advised. We can't say right now that those places will flood directly from groundwater rise, but it's certainly prudent to think ahead 20 years, and groundwaters will rise in 20 years. So yes, concern about those topics.
I'd just like to add that for the most part, the projects where they build subterranean garages do floodproofing around their structure. So for the most part, they are protected from groundwater inundation. But yeah, I generally agree with what Len was saying.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. And this might be for both Len and James. Has Redwood City agreed to build in the climate change infrastructure plan that One Shoreline described being done in Burlingame?
I'm not really aware of what's being done in Burlingame. I think I've looked into it a little bit and have the broad strokes of what's happening in Burlingame. We are generally starting, as I mentioned, the sea level rise vulnerability assessment is really the initial steps of figuring out how we need to start planning our infrastructure. And so there will be a larger planning effort that needs to occur. And I believe that's what Burlingame had been doing as far as their planning efforts. So we are engaging in those next steps to do, the planning efforts that Burlingame is doing. I'm not sure. Again, not sure if I completely answer that question, but I don't know if you have anything to add, Len.
I think you might be muted, Len.
Sorry. I think that I'm not sure, but I think the question is relating to zoning as much as project planning. And yeah, I can't speak to that. Basically, our position is we provide guidance to cities, and then it's up to the cities how they take that. And not all cities are taking all of our guidance for sure, but they pick and choose what works for their city. And so we just encourage the cities to pick up as much of it as makes sense for them.
Thank you both for that. And Dana, I'm going to pose the next question to you from Naomi. She asked to please clarify what responsibility non-EJ communities have to consider with shoreline toxic contamination in their adaptation plans.
There is contaminated sites for all communities, not just EJ communities, are one of the data layers that we're asking everybody to look at and consider. We're just calling it out as a top priority in EJ sites, but the guidelines also allow lots of flexibility for local priorities to come into play as well. So as cities are going through their planning process to develop these plans, there's a requirement for a lot of community engagement and understanding what cities want. So we're not saying that you don't need to or aren't, responsible for looking at contaminated sites in all communities. We're just calling out EJ communities as the top priority, and then imagine that many cities will also identify it as a local priority to look at all contaminated sites, particularly when there's an intersection with groundwater rise.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. I'm going to ask the next one back to you, James, from Michael. Asks, what is the projected timelines for levee upgrades along Redwood shores, and what is the FEMA timelines for requiring flood insurance for that area? Another tough one.
Yeah, another tough one. Like I mentioned, we are engaging in the RFP process. Once we get a consultant on board, it's expected to be a 3-year turnaround for completing those initial steps. And so that's basically let's call it 30% design and CEQA documentation. And so what comes after that is challenging to say exactly what the timeline is. I would imagine it's anywhere between 3 and 5 years of really developing the design to its completion, getting it out to bid, getting a contractor on board, and then building it out. Keep in mind there is the funding that is needed to figure out how to actually build the infrastructure that's needed, and so there's a challenge in and of itself for that. So it is a long-term process to build it all out. As far as the insurance documentation, what I will say is that working with other communities within the city, for the most part, FEMA has been, fairly accommodating as far as understanding that we are working towards a goal and that it takes time to get there. And so working with other areas, it has taken a long time to develop those plans, get the infrastructure built, and to proceed. And so I don't think that the insurance rates will be raised, and I don't think that FEMA will. FEMA is technically a partner on this. They are, providing us the grant funding to proceed on studying this and moving it forward. So I think they acknowledge that we are working towards the end of getting this built. We want to have it built. And so as long as we're working towards that goal of getting it all built, I don't expect that there will be any sort of insurance implications.
Appreciate that, James. Thank you. I'm just going to piggyback that with a question that I might ask other panelists to jump in on as well, Leonard, Dana as well. But just if managed retreat is being considered for sites susceptible to sea level rise anywhere along that shoreline. And the second part was, are federal and state funds or grants available to purchase part of properties from a developer that could be dedicated to managed retreat?
I mean, I think we are looking at opportunities for that as much as possible. It's more naturalistic approaches are generally a good idea, but because Redwood Shores in particular is already a built-out community and already has the levee system, more than likely the vast majority of it will be built-up levees and or some sort of seawall.
Great, thank you. And maybe Leonard, Dana, with a funding part of that or grants available, do you know if, Len, I'll hand it over to you maybe first.
So a couple thoughts on the managed retreat. First of all, it's not the same thing as wholesale community-wide managed retreat, but if you set buildings back from water, that's accomplishing the same ends of basically giving room for water and doing the development in a smart way. Of course, that's not the wholesale movement of a community, but I don't know that any community on our shoreline has the appetite for that. And certainly land costs are so high that that's not practical. There are a couple spots in Redwood Shores that might be candidates for this, create some natural areas. James showed the slide with the image of Redwood Shores, and one of the dashed lines about a potential levee alignment in the north, kind of east corner of Redwood Shores, if you will, or just north corner is one. And then there may be some spaces around the Silicon Valley Clean Water Plant that also could be kind of built out as wetlands. And there are some other locations along our San Mateo County shoreline that where we can take advantage of areas that have environmental benefits. It's different than, again, community-wide managed retreat. In terms of the funding question, so James talked about federal funding. That's what the FEMA grant is. There are the FEMA has a federal program regarding buyouts of repetitive loss properties. That's not what we're talking here. There are there's a state program called subventions that can be used for these kinds of things, but it's not a great fit for this. And so I think it's worth exploring between one shoreline and the city to see what that looks like. But that's not a conclusive answer about are there funds available, or even is this a good candidate project for that kind of activity? Dana, did you want to add anything?
I'll just add that we're really encouraging, managed retreat, any sort of land use change is a local decision. We're certainly encouraging people to think about how adaptation strategies need to change over time. So there may be a point when, the types of flood control that we're relying on now are no longer financially feasible, or there are better alternatives elsewhere. So I think in the guidelines, we encourage people to first and foremost consider if there are any places where protection of if an area is not developed that can be preserved as such. And then thinking long term, if retreat is not an option now, might there be a point in the future where some sort of tipping point is passed and it becomes something that the community starts thinking about in the future?
Great, thank you all so much for that. I'm going to ask Dana, you one more question here, and then team Troy, Eric, please let me know if there's other questions that we could verbalize at this point. I do see a bunch of questions that I've seen answers to, and others that I think we're going to have to take some time to respond to after the meeting. But Dana, there was one question if there's existing monitoring and enforcement provisions in the RSAP.
We are going to require that as each plan is developed locally, the local jurisdiction. So just to clarify, I didn't mention this in the presentation. All cities and counties in BCC's jurisdiction are required to do a plan, and they may work together to do a multi-jurisdictional plan, or they may do a plan on their own, similar to the way a lot of counties do local hazard mitigation plans. So there is a guideline in there, a plan requirement for a monitoring plan. So adaptation changes over time, projects get implemented, thresholds are crossed, different decisions have to be made. So we do ask people to consider what their own monitoring will be like. We're also requiring that cities and counties consider how they update their plans over time. That said, there is no enforcement that was given to BCDC for these plans. So if these plans aren't developed or if they aren't implemented over time, the only real downside is that you don't get access to prioritized funding from the state. But BCDC doesn't have any additional authority to enforce these plans.
Great, thank you so much, Dana. We had a question, or part of a question that came in that, Len, I'd love to get your input on. My question is, if a building is raised 5 feet by fill, what is the impact on adjacent properties? It's a question asked by Kristen. If you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I think that kind of thing would have to be analyzed as part of the development proposal, and that the city, I'm sure, like the Redwood City, like all cities, would take a close look at that analysis and just make sure it pencils out, and that there's no adverse impact to neighbors or adjacent public infrastructure or roadways or other kinds of things. So, I can't say without kind of taking a look at the exact example, but certainly any raising of a site creates opportunities for water to exit the site, of course, and I think Redwood City would take a close look at that. I don't know, James, you probably do that all the time as part of projects. And
absolutely. I mean, it's if there's a building that's very close to a property, it's the zone of influence, and so being a registered civil engineer, there's just certain calculations that you can do and figure that out. They would all, by necessity, need to be provided to our building department, and I'm sure they would take a very close look at that.
Great, thank you all for that. One question kind of following up on the undergrounding of parking was, if underground parking and mechanical are discouraged, what about bio-containment infrastructure? And I'm not sure who would like to take that one on first. Maybe Len, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't have much to say on that. I mean, I would look closely at anything that goes underground that close to the water, but in terms of the specific issues associated with biohazards, that would be something that I would assume the developer would need to hire a consultant team to do an analysis, and that the city would review that. So I don't have anything specific to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's very directly related to the fact that it's a landfill. There are always very special considerations that are, considered when you look at any of the permitting that's done for that, especially the underground utilities. Stormwater in particular will be, a challenge for the site. But with all engineering, when there's a will, there's a way. So it won't be problematic. It's just something that will get extra scrutiny for sure.
Thank you all again. We have about 10 minutes left here. Troy or Eric, I might ask you to jump on. I think there's a couple questions left to ask here. I might ask you to maybe highlight a couple that you might want to respond to and or ask the team to.
Sure. Yeah, I think I saw a question kind of asking about the nature of this forum and, kind of the involvement of the folks on this panel. So I just kind of wanted to reiterate that this is a city-led panel. It's not a panel that's a corporate panel or put on by the applicant. This is a city-led event, and the guest speakers tonight have graciously volunteered their time to help us out with, helping inform all of us in the community more about this topic.
Thank you, Troy. I believe, unless team I'm missing something, there are a lot of great comments that have been shared. There are questions that the team has been working feverishly to answer through the Q&A. And again, there's a lot of just great input that we're gathering here that will be part of the overall summary and or a follow-up FAQ as we kind of bring all this information together as a resource that will be shared out through the project website, including this video as a resource for those that weren't able to join us. And each one of these info sessions that we're putting together are, again, meant to be a resource that will continue to kind of build off each other and stay as a resource through the project website as we go through this process. Let's see, team, is there any other, I might be missing them, is there any other questions that we wanted to highlight for the team?
Well, just to say, I think there's a question or two about the sensitivity analysis, specifically within the chat, and we appreciate those comments. As you all know, or many of you know, our team is conducting 3 different types of sensitivity analysis for those who've been part of the process. We're currently working with the city to put them through a review process now so that we can finalize those and share those out with the community. The one will be on the primary topics covered by an environmental impact report. So those topics covered by the California Environmental Quality Act. We also have a transportation and an infrastructure utilities one, which we'll also be sharing out as soon as we get those through the review process. And we're also planning to host later on this year a kind of a forum where you can have an opportunity to ask some questions of our team about those particular sensitivity analyses. And I think we've talked a little bit about that, but wanted just to clarify that those are coming, and we're going to get those out to you all as soon as we can.
Thank you so much, Eric. Let's see. I am seeing a lot of general comments, and again, just to reiterate, as I believe we have here, as there are comments coming in directly about the Redwood Life proposal that we're not prepared to answer as part of this info session. As we've discussed, we have lined these up as a way to provide context, to provide information about how other communities in the region are dealing with similar challenges related to flooding and sea level rise, but we're not prepared to answer any questions here tonight directly related to the Redwood Life proposal. And I see quite a few questions that have popped up to that respect, and we've tried to respond the best we can through the Q&A function. So I am not seeing. Thank you, Sharon, for praising us for this session. We always love getting praises, and we so much value all of your time, and we're so grateful for the panelists volunteering their time here with us this evening as well. Again, to give us some perspective as we continue to navigate this challenge really across the region again. Let's see, I'm seeing a couple other, anything else, team, that we see coming in through?
Yeah, just the one that just came in about the concern about whether, about the landfill and sea level rise and groundwater, and absolutely, and that's in part why we're having this forum, so we can start this conversation and build a better knowledge and understanding for each of us. And many of you probably know this already, that the property owner Longfellow already had to submit a sea level rise assessment of their site. They're required to do that to the Regional Water Quality Board. So there are additional regulatory agencies who we've mentioned earlier in the program this evening, who are also considering these issues and thinking about them in their regulatory context as well. So those pieces of information are available, and that's a publicly available piece of information.
Thank you, Eric.
Eric, could I add something? Because I'm also looking at the questions, and I'm seeing the questions about landfill, and you know, these are fair questions. Groundwater is people are rapidly gaining an understanding of the groundwater impacts, both related to impacts to infrastructure, but also related to impacts to contaminants that are underground, not just landfills, but there's a lot of contaminants along our bay shoreline. And so I think as this project develops, the Redwood Life project, also there's a lot of understanding that will be developed over the next, let's say, 12 months about this. And the state legislature is actually looking very specifically at this issue. They just had a hearing in San Mateo County Assembly Committee that looked at groundwater rise and contaminants. So there's a lot of energy and information coming forward. I can't really speak to it right now, like some really like elevator pitch answer on this topic, but I think that this is good timing to gain an understanding for the city, for the residents, and all of us on this subject. And I just want to reiterate what was said earlier about this panel we have no relationship to Redwood Life. This is a city people, this is one Shoreline, completely separate government agency. BCDC is a state agency. This is nothing about Redwood Life. It's really the city asking us as different entities to participate in an information session for the public.
Thank you for that, Lynn. Appreciate that. Looks like we had a feverish round of questions coming in here, a couple comments. Let's see, I see responses from folks back to other questions. Is there any other questions, team, that we want to raise here?
No, but just to say there's a lot of questions about the project in here, and we really appreciate those. And those are ones that we can look at very specifically. We have feverishly taken notes on all of this. There's a sheet that we're pulling all of these questions into. So we'll have those available to us, and then we can work to answer those as we go through the process. Especially those ones that are very specifically about the project itself. But again, this is intended to be sort of a broader forum so that we can just build a better understanding both of the key issues that we're considering as part of this process, but also the broader regulatory context in which this potential project sits within. So we appreciate everyone's comments, even if we didn't get any questions, even if we had a chance to answer each and every one of them this evening.
Great. Well, unless there's any other questions that we want to go ahead and answer here, as you mentioned, thank you again for reiterating that, Eric, is we are tracking all of these great questions. It'll help kind of inform our process moving forward, and we'll do our best to create an FAQ, both of everything that was answered here verbally tonight, those that were dropped in the Q&A, and others that we'll have to noodle on here and respond to, so that we can use that as a resource along with the presentation that was provided here tonight as a resource as we move forward. So unless we had any other thoughts, I think we're pretty much close to time here this evening. Thank you again for your time and for being part of this process with us. It is it's a tricky topic that again many communities are challenged with, and we really appreciate all of the input we received. And just to reiterate, this presentation will be posted to the project website as a resource. We'll send a follow-up email as well to the email list that this all went out to, reiterating that, but it will be on that same project page that you saw when you signed up for this, when you went to the RSVP for this. Before we end, I also wanted to bring up the slides real quick to share what is coming up here. And Troy, I might go ahead and turn it back over to you to do a quick wrap.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Thanks for all the questions. And again, as Dave mentioned, we will be following up with responses to questions that were not addressed here. But the next steps from our side is the sensitivity analysis, as Eric discussed, will be released publicly as soon as the city has finished its internal review. So that will be posted publicly. We will then hold a webinar to discuss and answer questions about the results of that sensitivity analysis. We'll be planning on holding additional forums with one focused on the landfill. So some of the questions tonight will be carried over to that forum, I'm sure. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be holding a large workshop or a series of smaller workshops on the project alternative in early 2025. Any other questions or concerns for resources, please visit the website and sign up for the email list. And yeah, as this final slide shows, our next upcoming topics are the landfill and then life sciences to discuss.
Great, and that puts us right on time here. So thank you all again. We really appreciate you spending an hour and a half with us here this evening after, I'm sure, a long day for you all. Thank you again so much for the panelists and taking the time to put together these great presentations and being available to answer questions. We look forward to seeing you all at the next set of informational forums that we'll share out here soon, timing-wise, as well as upcoming workshops, as Troy mentioned. And again, all of this great information will be posted to the project website soon. So thank you again. Have a great evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you.